So I don't know how many of you went to Nate Ani's talk yesterday about interoperability, but one of the things that he mentioned was that Open Edx deployments are always a piece of a larger puzzle, and this presentation today is going to be about some of the puzzles at MIT. That work? Yes. Oh, I got to do my slides here, though. My team at MIT is called the ODL Engineering Team. We're part of the Office of Digital Learning. The Office of Digital Learning includes organizations like MITx and OpenCourseWare. But my team runs the instance of Open Edx on campus that's used by MIT students. And then we also develop applications around Open Edx to assist our faculty and to integrate with other systems at MIT. We like to think of ourselves as the mad scientists in digital learning, although we're more like the not so evil robot henchmen. So what do we do at MIT with Open Edx? We make a lot of stuff. We've made a lot of MOOCs. We've made a lot of on-campus courses, almost as many. And we have rerun courses a lot. And this means that the systems, we need to help faculty make courses quickly. We try to make them easy to reuse. And they also have to work with the other systems on campus. Not everything we do is a MOOC, though. On campus, our largest course is about 700 students in the system, and the average size is only about 91 students. But as I mentioned, the integration with other campus features is really critical, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to reach back into the past here and talk about some of our early integrations. I think this is useful because we use some features that aren't well known in the platform. Just believe me when I say if we did them again, we wouldn't do them the same way. So this slide is actually from the 2014 Open Edx conference when I talked about our Git-based workflow for courses. I did that with Carson Gee. I bring it up today because the challenge here was how to integrate the Open Edx platform with GitHub so that we would be able to manage course content in a versioned repository, but then update it on the platform every time a course changed. And we did that with a simple application, an API proxy between GitHub and Open Edx. The proxy would receive the webhooks from GitHub every time a course was changed. And then it would update that course on disk as a Git repository. And then it would use a management command in Open Edx to update the course. There's a management command for importing courses. Not a lot of people are familiar with these management commands. It's part of Django. Something that systems administrators and DevOps use a lot. Don't really think of it as an API, but it can be used that way, particularly when you don't have anything better to work with. There's more details in the presentation from the last conference, or 2 conferences ago. Slide am I on now? There we go. I bring it up here partially because last year we worked on a REST API for importing and exporting courses. So to have something a little more robust, something that didn't require the privilege of a management command. Unfortunately, it was one of these cursed PRs where it had a bunch of merge conflicts. It had to be reverted a couple times, and it's languishing at this point. There was another team that was going to work on it, but they didn't get a chance to. Eventually, we'll come back to it, but if anybody really wants to be able to remotely import and export courses from an edX instance, I'd love to talk to you about it, because that's something that we'd like to see. So in the theme of legacy projects, oh, that is a little smaller than I thought it would be. Another integration that we did is exporting grades from edX into the Campus Gradebook. This is a feature that's part of the legacy instructor dashboard. How many people have ever seen the legacy instructor dashboard? Okay, a few more than I expected. Most of the features from this legacy dashboard have been ported to the current instructor dashboard, but this one hasn't. What it does is allows the instructor to press a button and post the grades for their course or a particular problem to an endpoint. There's also a way to bring back enrollments if you want to pull enrollments from another system. This is how we implemented it at MIT. So from the legacy dashboard, it posts a CSV file. And then we did another one of these API proxy servers so that we could transform that CSV file into JSON data that we could post to a REST API that our central campus IT services provides. That proxy server also has to handle authentication because the edX API that does the posting doesn't do any authentication. So it's another community opportunity. As I mentioned, the legacy dashboard kind of sounds like it's going away, and in fact, it's going to be gone in Eucalyptus. Right now, it's behind a feature flag. So this is something that we will be working on, but if anybody has some thoughts or opinions about what would make grade exporting helpful to interact with other systems, I'd love to hear about it. Okay, so let's talk about some more modern stuff, some more reliable features, REST APIs. edX has a ever-growing number of REST APIs. The only challenge right now is figuring out where they are, what they do, and how they work. This is getting a lot better, and if you keep track of the documentation that work is being done at edX, there's a lot of work being done to document those REST APIs. A lot of them are currently internal, but there are more and more of them that are becoming available. There's also a plan to coalesce them all into one API gateway. So I'm going to show you some APIs today. The endpoints will probably change by this time next year because of that API gateway, but I want to give you an idea of what's available, what to expect. So there's a couple projects I'm going to talk about as examples of how we're using these APIs. This first one here is the MIT MicroMasters. Anant mentioned this yesterday in the keynote. If you missed the details, basically online learners can take a series of MOOCs, in this case on edX.org. If they pass the MOOCs and they pass a capstone exam, they get a MicroMasters credential from MIT, and they have the opportunity to apply for an on-campus master's degree. And then if they get accepted to the on-campus degree, they get credit for their online work. So there's a lot of information that we want to be able to collect and act on from the edX system with our campus systems so that we know who's getting this MicroMasters credential. When they apply, we don't want to make them enter all their data again. We need to know that they passed the MicroMasters, et cetera, et cetera. And this site is also going to have some additional features to make these online students feel like they're part of the campus experience. We're still working that part out. Up on the right here, I don't know if you can see the red button, but the site's going to start off with a sign-in to edX.org. And then the MicroMaster students are able to track their progress through the MicroMaster program, and then eventually this grayed out button that says apply for master's degree becomes active after they've filled in all the bubbles, passed the courses, and they can be on their way to applying. So this is the basic flow that we have in progress right now. Our MicroMasters portal authenticates the learner over OAuth. And then once we know who the learner is and they've authenticated with Edx, we start pulling their profile, their enrollment, certificates, and grades. We mix them all up in our web application and then push data out to the registrar and the admissions process. So I'm going to walk through some of the APIs and go through some of the details on these things, starting with the profile. Sorry I can't do a live demo here, but if you want to try to follow along with your laptops. What's great about the Profile API is you can actually access it on any Open edX that's up to date or on edx.org right now. You just need a user session. So if you log into edx.org right now and go to an endpoint that looks like that, you have to use a real username. It'll give you the user's profile data. It respects the authorization and privacy settings of that user's profile. So if I look at my own profile, I'll see all the profile data, but then if I look at someone else's, I'll get just the data that they're exposing. What you're seeing here is actually, I copied and pasted this from the web interface that comes up if you go to that endpoint on edX. So one of the nice things about the way that they've been implementing these APIs is they actually present a sort of self-documenting interface. If you go to the endpoint as in a web browser, you get an HTML page that gives you some documentation about the API. It gives you sample requests and responses. If it's an API that you can post or patch to, it'll give you a form. And if you know how to write JSON in the right format, you can sometimes actually experiment with interacting with the API. So I thought I had an example here, but you can actually use this to change your profile. Unfortunately, edX doesn't collect a lot of information in the profiles, but that's a separate issue. Another one of the APIs that we're using is enrollment. Yesterday, Nate Ani talked about this a little bit. He was using a modified one that he had done some enhancements to. We're just using the vanilla enrollment API. And we use this to find out what courses an individual learner has been enrolled in. So if you think about the use case of our MicroMasters portal, we need to know if a student's enrolled in the appropriate courses. And with the Enrollment API, it also supports a post. So you can use that post for the current learner to enroll themselves in a course. So we can present a button that says enroll. Unfortunately, though, that's limited to the audit track. The other tracks where you have to pay money have a different flow, maybe for obvious reasons. And that's the response you get after you've enrolled. So I posted saying I wanted to enroll in an audit course, and it comes back and says, yeah, you're enrolled. The certificate API is actually one that we wrote. This was information that edX wasn't currently exposing through an API, although it was available in a simple table in the database. But we wanted to be able to get request information about the learner and what courses they had gotten certificates in. That's an indicator that they passed the course. And it also includes information about what their grade was. So for an API, for a relatively simple API like this, it's not too bad to make a contribution for it. I don't think I mentioned this before. Edx uses a thing called Django REST framework for coding the APIs, and it gives us all the nice side benefits of that documentation and the HTML interface. Since this was a read-only API, it was a relatively simple one to implement. Also, the data is all public. Certificates is something that everybody's supposed to know about, so we didn't have to deal with authorizations very much. And just a note of process, we posted to the Edx code list before we started working on this. There was a little bit of dialogue about what the endpoint should be, what future API will actually replace this, and some conversation about what the fields were and that kind of stuff. And once we had some basic agreement about that, we got to work and submitted a PR. I wanted to say a few words about Oauth also. How many people here are familiar with Oauth? Okay, so I'll go through this pretty quickly then. Oauth, as a user, you've probably experienced it when you tie together accounts on Facebook and LinkedIn, any kind of third-party app. This is the very current state of Edx Oauth if you're trying to authenticate a user, authenticate and authorize a user. This is in master right now. There's been a fair amount of changes since Dogwood was released, but this will all be part of Eucalyptus. So user signs in. They get directed to the Edx login or registration page. Although if they're already logged in, they'll skip that step. It works whether the user has got an account or if they have to create an account. Either way, when they finish logging in or finish the account creation process and they have a session going, they get bounced to an authorize view. This still needs some work, in case it's not obvious. Read and write scope are not the most clear options to users. It's not at all clear what they're giving us permission to do at this point. We'd like to see that actually reflect the profile data and the access, the ability to enroll them in courses and the access to grades that they're actually giving us permission for. And that's something that Edx is planning to do some work on. And if you want to dig into this in master right now, there is an interface in the Django admin that you have to go through to create an Oauth application and integrate with it. Not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm happy to talk to anybody about how that works. There's some possibility that this might get better too, but this is the standard UI. Another thing that's missing for our application is being able to get individual learner grades, current grades, as opposed to final grades, out of Edx. Oh, wow. That was taking a lot longer than I thought. So I think this is something we're probably going to start working on next sprint. But I have to look into, yesterday morning, Marco mentioned per learner analytics and insights, and I have to find out about if that might be able to help out a little bit. So those are all the APIs we used for the MicroMasters project. Another thing that we've been working on is a teacher's portal. This is a website that's going to be gathering together a bunch of different resources at MIT that we want to share with teachers. Sorry, I don't have a graphic for it, but it's basically a catalog. And in particular, it's a catalog of, or this part of it is a catalog of Edx courses that are available as what's called CCXs, or custom courses on Edx. Has anybody heard about CCX? Okay, many fewer. It's kind of a stealth feature, but it's in the platform. Pretty sure it was part of Dogwood. If you ever need to rerun a course and only change the dates and give somebody else access to run it, that's probably the tool you want to use, or you should at least look at. And happy to answer any questions about that too. But the APIs that we're using, this is another API that you can try out right now. It's one of a few course APIs, but this is basically being able to access the basic metadata about a course. So it's the kind of thing that you can use to build an external catalog. There are better APIs on their way for doing catalogs, but this was good enough for our purposes right now because, given the course ID, we could get the course image, we could get the name, and we could get the HTML part of the course overview. There's other data in there too about like start dates, end dates, that kind of stuff. The other thing that's interesting about this API is it actually gives you a URL that you can make a follow-up call to get the course structure. This is called the Course Blocks API. It actually does a couple different things, but the basic idea is that you can retrieve the tree structure of the course. Not all the content, but you can understand what the structure is. And we use this to get to build a list of the chapters in the course for our catalog, because sometimes it's easier to understand what a course is about if you can see what all the chapters are. And this is the CCX API. So this is something that we contributed. It's a version 0 still. This CCX API did two things for us. It let us get a list of all the custom courses that had been created off of one single master course. So what you're seeing here is the call where you pass the master course ID, and then you'll get a list back. And you can see that you can get an ID for the individual custom course, the name, and the email of the edX user who's coaching that course. You can post to this API as well and use that to create CCXs. So in our use case, we wanted to be able to not only present these options to teachers, but give them a way that they could request a custom course. You post with a master course ID, your name. You can also set how many students are allowed to take the course. And that's the response. Okay. So to wrap it up, legacy APIs are always an option. If you want to go and look at the management commands, there's a lot of kind of useful stuff in there. There's a lot of APIs internal to the platform. But if you work with that kind of stuff, it's going to be hard to maintain it. There's no guarantees that those will still be available and still be available with the same interfaces. Whereas, in particular with these REST APIs, there's a commitment with each version to having a stable interface. And as I mentioned, the good news is edX is working very deliberately towards a more formal definition of these APIs, both internal ones and ones that are deliberately external. And in some cases, the only distinction between internal and external is whether someone has gone to the work of figuring out the authentication and the authorization. Django REST framework, which I mentioned, is a really useful tool in all of this, and it makes it a lot easier to be able to contribute something. And then once something's in the platform, it actually makes it a lot easier for third-party developers like us to discover APIs, to experiment with them, and see what the possibilities are. And the documentation is coming. I've seen it. I follow all the edX repos. You can follow the documentation repo and see all the work that's going on there. These are some of the opportunities that I mentioned for future work. Someone will get to all these eventually. We're certainly going to be working on some of them, but if anybody is interested in pitching in or wants to know what's already been tried and isn't worth trying again, we should talk. Have to thank a lot of people who put time in. I'm sure I don't have everybody, but there's the folks on my team and our contractors. We've had users, we've had great reviewers from edX for our code. Also the edX architects who have helped us over the time with designing things. And of course, thanks to the Open edX team for making this possible. And we've got some time for questions, I think. Okay, great. Yes?
Earlier on in the presentation, you talked a little bit about a program. Are you measuring grades at a course level or program level, and does that mean you're doing it sequentially when you're in the MicroMasters?
I think some of that stuff is still getting worked out, but with the current MicroMasters that students are participating in at this point, supply chain management, I think it's simply they have to pass each MOOC and then a capstone exam. There isn't any overarching grade requirement other than passing each individual one. Is that?
Well, what I was trying to get at is on the dashboard that you were showing, you had the concept of measuring the program progress in a program.
Oh, yeah.
So I wasn't sure if you were doing courses sequentially.
I
It's
see.
a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Versus if a student is in 4 courses or 2 courses at the same time. How are you doing that progress right there?
Yeah, yeah. So that is another thing that we're still working out a little bit. But this particular supply chain management MicroMasters is intended to be taken sequentially. Users can, there's no enforcement of the prerequisites though, so if users take it out of order, as long as they have taken all the courses, they can still complete the MicroMasters. I think as we start looking at other MicroMasters, I think that's going to get a little more complicated because some courses actually do have prerequisites. And there's some support in Open edX for prerequisites, but I'm not familiar with it yet. That's something I have to learn about. Yeah.
I work with a platform that also serves some on-campus courses, and we've ran into a few situations like deadline extensions for subgroups of students. And we were wondering if you guys ran into a similar situation, beating against some of the date constraints on the platform, and if so, how would you have done?
Yeah, there's actually another undocumented feature called individual due date extensions. There's a feature, it's behind a feature flag, and if you turn that on, it provides an interface in the instructor dashboard, not the legacy, the real instructor dashboard, where the instructor can grant an extension per student per problem. That it doesn't scale very well if you have a really large class and need to grant a lot of extensions. I'm sorry to say. I just feel your pain because we've had to deal with that. There's a different implementation for exams. If you use a timed exam, there's a way also to give a student an extension on a timed exam. So that has so far covered all our needs. Although in practice, I don't know how often instructors just change due dates in order to deal with the problem.
But is it possible to use individual due dates to peer assessment problems?
Almost certainly not. I'm sorry to say. The peer assessment internally has about 4 dates that are used, and they aren't exposed to the same interface that the individual due dates address. I should add that to the list of opportunities.
Individual due dates on the shifted?
That's one of there's like a preceding product question of what should be done in that case. You had a question back there?
I was wondering what your particular use case for the CCX courses were. We have a group on campus who's interested in using it and having separate coaches, you know, have access to the same course as well. Particularly, they're interested in having those coaches have access to certain features in the instructor dashboard, but not give them access to Studio.
Yeah.
And from what I'm seeing, that's not possible right now. So I'm just curious as to how you guys use it.
Yeah.
And around that.
I didn't have a lot of time to go in depth, but there's basically a coach's dashboard that we provide, and we've exposed what we thought were the necessary features from the instructor's dashboard. But that's something that's being constantly looked at. And if you're around on Friday, we're going to be talking to some folks who are going to be working on it some more. But there isn't any fundamental reason why some of the instructor dashboard features aren't exposed there.
We've been using the course system of the blocks, but we haven't been able to access the HTML inside of the block. Do you have any API that you can access that? We know that you can put something into a course with the API, but you cannot get the content of it.
Yeah, without going too deeply into the history of these things, that particular API, the Blocks API, was originally written for the mobile application. So its sort of capabilities and limitations have to do with what the mobile app needed. I'm not sure what the current state is, but I know that as they've added more functionality to the mobile app, like being able to display certain problem types, I think if it's not this API, there's got to be another way that they're accessing that material. I could tell you who to talk to at edX. In fact, maybe Andy knows.
The thing is that we can get it as Studio gets it, but you get it also in HTML format, not in the database format. So if you want to do things with that,
Yeah.
you have to recode the HTML to get the content of the database, and it's much more difficult.
Any other questions? Okay, well, if you have follow-ups, I'll be around the rest of the week. Yeah, very excited about the possibilities to integrate with edX. Thank you.